Welcome back to the Redacted Culture Cast. This is episode 93, part 2, with Ahmad of Lead and Steel. If you were able to listen to the first half, we started talking about what it meant to start a manufacturing company that was going to challenge the industry in regards to optics. I mean, optics is it's a small anecdote, but if you look at the last 10 years, optics have been one of the most indicative signs of the kind of short 10 years of time. I remember when I got out of the military, you had two choices for your rifle. You had an Aimpoint T1 Micro or you had an EOTech, and that was it. If you had anything else, you were either trying to be weird or you had an ACOG or something, or it kind of fit into that camps. But now, like, we're looking at a massive swath of options, and it's nice to see new faces challenging the meta, so to speak. So I want to hear a little bit more about the LP1 and the Pandora in the end of the show, but we were leaving off on talking about kind of the legal aspects and how culture has changed and what your view on culture goes. So, Ahmad, would you reintroduce yourself for those who are coming back into the show?
Absolutely. My name is Ahmad. I'm the CEO of Lead and Steel. We are an optics, small arms, and nylon manufacturer in Central Ohio, and our goal is to absolutely dominate the industry. We bring on the best talent that we can to bring you the best products that are, practically feasible. So that's who we are.
Awesome. All right. So, for those who are listening, you can always head over to redactedculture.locals.com to join the back end of the black site of our conversations. That's going to be the members only area. And then on top of that, we've got our newsletter, because the reason why we hold a newsletter is because it's the best way to keep a hold of you. It's the censorship free version, and that is available on our website. So, that'd be at redactedllc.com. Other than that, this is the Redacted Culture Cast, where we talk about what we think to be right and true and good, going one level deeper than the anecdotal conversation. So here we go. We left off on looking at we were looking at the change in gun culture from a very granular inter-gun culture conversation, and now I want to draw back something that you had said earlier, and that was in 2012, gun culture was very monolithic in a sense. Maybe it was a monoculture of a sort. It was very. It had It seemed to have a very one tone song, and
hmm
now we've seen so many different variations of it change and sort of proliferate, and that can be, on the one hand, a good thing, because we might see some of the values of diversity, but then we also are met with a threat of like multiculturalism as well. What is your take on how you've seen that develop and change from the people's perspective, from you as an individual, and then how have you seen good and bad come out of that, especially the bad side being artificial, forced diversity?
Cool. We'll get to that. Yeah, we should get to that. As for the first part, some of the good that's come out of it, we've gotten. Um, I think we've gotten somewhere a little better than where we were 10 years ago as to what the industry looks like now, in terms of, representing what it's like to be a traditional gun owner in the United States of America, as well as, what it has to look like and what it doesn't have to look like, right? And I think we've properly defined what it's like to be a supporter of the Second Amendment, and distilled it to the core, which is our constitutional liberties shall not be infringed. Right, and I think by doing that, by the industry going in the direction that it's going, uh, we're beginning to show people that we're as a population, people who are particularly interested in supporting the Second Amendment, and who want to keep their rights where they are, or even get back some of the rights that have been eroded over the years. We're more educated, right? And as a result of our education, we're at least theoretically more aptly prepared to fight against whatever you know large funded legislation may be in our particular jurisdiction. And I think the good of that is that it helped bring more people on who are on the fence about firearm ownership. And I think it was especially imperative, post post COVID. Seeing the state of affairs of this country as things began to degrade relatively rapidly with the threat of a pandemic. Seeing people, begin to jump into the necessity of what it's like to be a firearm owner, particularly when their bubble pops, right? The social security, the safety security that they may have, or the privilege that they may have enjoyed, no longer being there. It gives them a little taste of what it's like to live in, maybe a third world country to an extent, or war torn nation, or a nation ran by an authoritarian regime. We have it pretty good here relative to other things, all things being equal, and our ability to preserve the benefits that we have being Americans, having our freedom and right to free speech, and the right to keep and bear arms, among other things, uh, really is a privilege that can be very quickly eroded by the best intentions. So I think that's some of the benefit of that. But if you don't mind, if you can clarify for me what you mean by the second part of your question, which was maybe potentially some of the downsides of, was it multiculturalism? Is that what you said? Um,
Yeah, multicultural. I know multiculturalism, a term that in my this is probably going to hurt in some ways as far as definitional clarity, but multiculturalism is I'm explaining it terribly.
yeah.
Multiculturalism is the skin suit that wears the idea of having collected values while differentiations in aesthetics and perspectives coming together. And
Okay.
so, in some ways, multiculturalism tries to achieve the outcome without doing the hard work. It's the cheater's answer to getting along and having different people of different backgrounds and belief systems and aesthetic choices live in some sense of harmony. And why I refer to it specifically as multiculturalism is because it begins with the philosophical statement that people of diametrically opposed and philosophically contradictory ideas can live in harmony right next to each other. If I believe that drinking water is good and you believe that drinking water literally is evil, how can we live in the same world? And I know that's an example that's a little bit um, absurd in its own way. So multiculturalism tries to accomplish this by flattening all of our values and saying what you believe to be right and true is actually less important than whatever the multicultural bubble says to be right and true. And as long as you agree with the meta religion, everything else below can get along. But in order to do that, you have to subtract all the parts of those different ideas and different belief systems that give it meaning. And then as a result, you might achieve some sort of multiculturalism, as in people have different aesthetic choices and they live in some sort of pseudo harmony, but they're
Mm,
just committing suicide. That's all it is they've all they have no meaning, their statements have no value, their religious claims have nothing of gravitas. And
mhm,
so how you achieve the outcome that multiculturalism attempts to hijack and claim is that you have a society that has a collected set of base values, which come in the form of rights, and then on top of that there's room for variation, but that as long as your belief system doesn't contradict those base values, like let's just say you have a right to self-determination in the extent of living. That means if I can at any given time does that claim that you are less than human and then get rid of you, then my belief system is incompatible with that rights-based system. And this is where I think I tend to ruffle some feathers, is that I don't believe that multiculturalism is achievable
mm,
if the only way that it accomplishes it is that it cuts off the heads of all the trees and says, why aren't you growing?
mm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. What would you then say to the past, I don't know, 200, almost 300 years of America being what it is, being the separation of church and state, but also being the cultural mixing pot? Do you think there's potentially a change in how society has operated from this previous idea of immigration, multiculturalism, integration into this experiment that we call the United States? Has there been a shift recently, then that formed into something else where you've seen like the chopping of heads, if you will? And is that what you're talking about, or do you think that the experiment in general is inherently faulted?
So if the experiment was going to start within a microcosm of just it's typically described as just Judeo-Christian values, right?
Yeah.
Now, I think the common historical approach that people take is that it was founded by pilgrims and Christians and different people of like generally the people of a certain Christian faith. And then it invited people in, and this is where you get different form of race baiting and different sort of all these other kind of conversations to come into and criticize it for calling itself a Christian nation or not a Christian nation. However, I'm going to make a point of clarification. America is not the only or the first example of a population existing together with different forms of belief systems. And it's not the only time, because we've seen it in Rome, we've seen it in the Ottoman Empire, we've seen it in other different examples, right?
Yeah.
The issue with these systems and what I think happened in America is that while we gained a diversity of opinions and backgrounds and worldviews, the reason the things that caused it to that are causing it to go awry is that we're trying to skip the integration period, and the integration period has to happen voluntarily. And so I don't mean integration in the sense of, okay, you're here now, you follow our rules and you have to believe our things and attend our cultural differences. Is that it's rather the integration is that the people who are living there and who are also are coming to live there have the opportunity to voluntarily participate in community with one another.
Hmm.
Instead, we have cultivated opportunities through the formats of immigration, whether it's through refugee immigration or cultural differences, that have given people the opportunity to live as neighbors,
Hmm.
but not as neighbors in that sense,
Just
like
community
a-
members,
as
if you will.
as neighbors next to each other, but not as neighbors together. So some of that is completely understandable looking from a grand perspective back in. Is like, how can you expect somebody to figure this out from a 1980s perspective or an 1890s perspective where your worldview is this big and it's getting bigger and bigger?
Hmm.
And so on the one hand, we have influences like the internet changing the way that we interact with one another as a whole. And the microcosm version of this is gun culture is like a tribe of Vikings. We
Yeah.
generally fight each other until we have a collected enemy, and then we get together, we do something against them, and we go back to infighting. And that's just kind of repeated. However, multiculturalism in the way that it's being presented in our day is that it's completely artificial and it's completely fake and it's dishonest. And how it comes across as dishonestly is that it says we can achieve the outcome of getting along without addressing the underlying reasons why we would even do that to begin with.
In the
And
sense,
how
forgive me for interrupting you. In the sense that the conversation should not be had. It should just be, don't talk politics, don't talk religion. Just agree on the fact that you both like Waffle House.
no, actually, it's the inverse. We should be talking politics.
Hmm.
We should be talking religion.
Hmm.
We should be talking about the things that we care about, that we think that are right and true and good,
Yeah.
instead of assuming that you and I can get along by assuming that we share collected values under the guise of multiculturalism.
Okay.
S- That's what it is. Is it's the it's the inverse of the assumption.
Yeah, for
Multi
sure. Yeah.
so if multiculturalism is the assumption that we can get along as long as we don't talk about anything meaningful, what that does is it sets it up for a monoculture authoritarian regime.
Hmm. Yeah.
Instead, what we can do is we can accomplish that by having that conversation ourselves and recognizing that we will have differences. It's like in any sort of meaningful theological conversation, I recognize that you're going to have one perspective and I can have another, but what we're both seeking out is we're both seeking truth.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's a it's an interesting perspective, and I guess from my perspective, it's I'm curious as to what you think brought about this. I mean, we can call it things like cancel culture, we can call it hush hush culture, or whatever it is, as a potential symptom of not wanting to have conversations about things that realistically are just shunned. But from my perspective, it's cool that you bring it up because it's interesting to think about. If some of the more formal institutions of society, I mean, obviously we have separation of church and state for a reason, right? And we have constitutional guarantees of our, Bill of Rights, and most notably, we have the right to free speech. So why isn't it being adequately utilized, right? To be able to have these conversations. And is that a symptom as a result of politics? Is it a symptom as a result of mainstream media targeting particular groups or blaming particular groups for um, societal issues and not wanting to talk to people across the aisle? And in some ways, how is the internet also solving that? Because we've seen like Twitter, for example. We've
Mhm.
seen Meta right now on Facebook and Instagram, the types of things that you can say and market and things that you can't say and can't market, in relation to this newer upheaval, post Twitter buyout and privatization. I'd be curious to think, at least from your input, how you think the internet is both harming these conversations that you think we should have, and helping them as well.
Yeah, so I don't believe that we have a separation of church and state. I don't think we have it in the way that we think about it. We have a separation of the church or the Christian church and the state.
Okay.
But the assumption of the separation of church and state needs to be clarified
Mm-hmm.
pretty heavily,
Mm-hmm.
because an example of when we talk about the separation of church and state, we should probably talk about what that means. Are we talking about the institution that deals with the pulpit, or the institution that has some sort of let's just say authority over religious practices
Mm-hmm.
cannot also be the same institution that has authority over the legal practices?
Mm-hmm.
If so, who informs what laws are just? Because justice is not a legal term justice is not an a priori legal term. It actually has to come from some sort of philosophical theory.
Mm-hmm.
And now you're starting to deal with codes of morality, and
Mm-hmm.
what deals with morality but religion. And
Mm-hmm.
so the separation of church and state is not something that is easily maintained.
Yeah. Yeah. I
But
mean, go ahead.
when we talk about that, that's where we start to get some clarification. Perhaps the separation of church and state is that the man carrying the sword is not also the man at the pulpit,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the person whose job to, and this is where you see separation of powers in the United States government. That's a good
Sure.
example of it. But we also recognize that these two things are also still integrated, because the man who is the policeman has to make moral decisions on the ground because he's the one with the skin in the game and he's the one who's there.
Certainly.
So it's a complicated process, but it can be achieved. But we also have better warning signs of when that breach is crossed. For example, you have the Spanish Inquisition
Mm-hmm.
in American, or not in American, famous historical event where the church chose to wield the law, wield the sword. And then you have the communism. You have the communism of Russia, which said that the state was God, or functionally turned the state into the church as well, and then wielded the sword and the pulpit at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So then, when that comes into the latter part of your question of the internet, and how that has helped people in the negative, and or how it has had positive and negative effects. A positive effect is it has created better inroad, or it has created faster inroads for people like you and I to have conversation with one another,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it has provided an opportunity for you and I to have a conversation about differences in opinion. It has given an avenue of approach for honest interlocutors to have conversations about the things that they matter about, and that's a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
It has also closed the loop for um, different forms of economics. It allows me to run a business like this. I don't have to go through certain gatekeepers. It's certainly done that. It has provided decentralization as the standard, as in it is less important that I go through a network to get to you, as rather I can talk to you, and if I can provide value to you, we can voluntarily choose to participate in community with one another.
Mm-hmm.
So it has provided decentralization, and it has added value to voluntary participation.
Yeah.
The negative side of it is that it has given, this is actually a negative that becomes a positive. It has given room for dishonest actors to participate in places where they should be are not allowed. Is probably the best way of saying it. So people who put on a good show can bullshit their way through things. And it is also, but the ultimate hardest thing that I think, it's a negative that leads to a positive, is that the internet has provided access to information without giving us methods of evaluating information. And
And it's
that
only
is,
making it worse with AI, frankly.
oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. And who knows how crazy it'll get, but we have access to information without the ability to evaluate it. And now we're trying to figure out methods of evaluating that information. And that's where we're at in the chain. So the negative is that now people have access to all this information, and whether it's a news media company that writes a lie that gets picked up by another news media that quotes it as a lie, and it continues quoting it as a lie while that first person takes it down, technically all these people are correct, but now the lie has gone around the world 3 times before the truth starts coming out, and you have social and political issues.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
that's those are not, I don't think those are very emotionally satisfying answers, but those are the ones I
No,
have.
no, no. That that's. I like how you recap that. I think it poses a benefit as well as a challenge.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we live in the post-information age. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. So either you're going to learn to evaluate information, or you should stop participating meaningfully.
Hmm. Yeah, I just can't wait for the day where my grandkids come up to me and say, "Hey, granddad, is this video real? Do you remember this, or was this doctored by AI?" And I got to look at it and be like, "No, I remember when that kid ate shit on the YouTube, or, whatever the heck it was. That was real."
Yeah. Meanwhile, you're actually a dementia patient, and be like, I don't
Yeah,
remember
I love having
anything.
grandkids. And they're like, "What you guys going on about kids they doesn't have
Yeah,
again?"
that's a horrible joke. I shouldn't have gone that dark, but yeah, it's just like, yeah, maybe we're all just brains in a pod.
Yeah, yeah,
So
fun times, man.
yeah. So where were we at? We were talking about. I know we started kind of running on the edges of multiculturalism, and
Yeah. Yeah,
and
I really just wanted to like ask and clarify what your definition of multiculturalism was, and the downsides, because like I'm primed to view it in a particular light, right? As someone who
yep.
went to a very progressive institution twice, right,
Hmm.
and who also comes from like a diverse background, right, and Muslim and Palestinian, right. For me, when I hear the terms, like I think multiculturalism poses a challenge to society. I think to myself, okay, I'm inherently cross wiring that with immigration and diversity of opinion and input. And I'm thinking, okay, why is that a bad thing? Because this is the foundation of America, And then, like with your actually, obviously your technical expertise and being able to talk about it, how some aspects of my multiculturalism in with a particular, I guess, definition or philosophy may end up silencing voices, may end up subtracting, like you said, people's inherent values, so that they do in fact form a monolith of ideas, not necessarily contributing with a diversity of input and having open, direct conversation, but really just accepting a particular philosophy and then moving on with their day, thinking that they are indeed contributing to the idea pool, and realistically, they're not. I hope I kind of summarized that properly, but especially for the viewers at home who are watching or listening to this, I know you probably talked about it a bajillion times, but like for me to explain it means to understand it better. And so,
No, I think it's the right answer to do it. Like that's what we have to do, because I am interested in how you approach, like, okay, so let's do it this way. You
yeah.
said you come from a progressive education department, but
Yeah.
you're working in the firearms industry.
Mhm.
How does that happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's as a result of like, I mean, we go back to morality and what we think is good versus bad, right?
Hmm.
Does that mean that myself I'm a progressive, or I have progressive values? Yeah, I think for some of my values, I think you can consider them progressive if you wanted to tack them on, right? Some
Sure.
of my personal input, not necessarily lead and steel, right? But if I look at education or healthcare, for example, I may be more left leaning, if you will. But that's if we have to categorize those things as left leaning, same way we categorize firearm ownership as right leaning. I personally don't, right?
Yeah,
I
I
that's I
don't think those definitions hold very well anymore.
yeah.
I mean, probably the closest thing that we have to deal with is, how do you I think the closest example of a left-right binary in this one is, how do you justify supporting a candidate who is advocating for confiscation or something like that,
Mhm.
while also claiming to be, like, that's I'm not using this
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
as an
No,
accusation.
yeah,
It's the
no,
closest thing to a binary. It's like, in some ways you can vote for anybody you want to, but Joe Biden, if you are part of the gun culture. But the moment you do, it's like, w- there's an inconsistency here.
yeah, for sure. It's how do you square those ideas that seem diametrically opposed in your head,
And
right?
I don't think this falls on gun owners themselves, or the gun culture. I don't think it's their responsibility. I think the responsibility falls on the person who says I can do both to justify it.
Yeah, there's a little bit of mental gymnastics there, most certainly. I mean, you can have progressive values, but ultimately, the way I see it, where I personally get most of the feedback from, some of my buddies and stuff is like, listen, this is the nature of our political system. I'm forced to choose, what I believe is the lesser of two evils, and I have to, do the mental gymnastics associated with it, right? And that's more of a fault of our political system, not necessarily a fault of the gun owners, like you stated. And it sucks, but it is what it is. Hence, representative politics.
Yeah, well, let's also not be nihilists. How do we make it better? How
Yeah.
do we make it better from the inside out? This is where my fundamental political philosophy, being decentralization, is that change truly does come from the roots,
Hmm.
and that is what we believe. Change comes from, like, the best reaction between what you call the church and the state comes from the pulpit and comes from the people
Hmm.
who talk to each other and care about each other and build their communities out to be robust and spend time in community with one another. And that does have to come upwards, and it only goes as high as it's useful. And so fine, might exist on a state level and it might exist on a community level, but that's where you find your genuine interaction.
Yep.
So, like, I think that's where it works. And so, how do you describe progressive values then? How does a value get described as being progressive?
That's pretty difficult, right? I think for the most part, what we choose to attribute a progressive value is um, what we see, more statistically in line with a particular, political group. So if we see that this, hot button issue, let's talk immigration, for example, because it's on brand, right? If we see that one side of the political aisle, namely, mainstream media's aspect of that, particular political group, is narrating some own opinion, some of their own like particular opinions about that, then we can attribute that, to them, right? And so if we talk about immigration as something that has a common narrative between left wing, media, then we could, attribute those particular opinions to, more progressive values. But I think shorthand, it's difficult to categorize. I think it's only easy to categorize when you have something that's very, very openly, being utilized by, a particular set of like talking points from a media company. It's one of the
Mhm.
big things. So that's the way I look at it, right? But if I had to give you a, you know uh, an example of that, yeah, I think a progressive, let's say, opinion on something would be like, I think we have a right to healthcare, right, in this country, right, because traditionally that's being circulated by, political pundits on the left wing, and being circulated by, those think tanks and stuff like that, and then you could then, by extension, say that, yeah, it could be more of a right wing political talking point to say, I think all firearms, um, or rather, like, I think it's a point to say, hey, I think you have a God given right to own a firearm, any firearm, right, and consider that a right wing, um, opinion. Even though I disagree with it, it's unfortunately, for whatever reason, only the right wing pundits pick that up, right? So it's really, we unfortunately have to delegate and relegate these opinions to the people that shout at us through our television screen, or more notably our cell phone screens.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, in some ways, progressive has become a brand.
Mm,
Other
I
than
agree with
just,
that.
it's become a brand name, right? So, traditional is now a brand.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, traditional is a calling card of the right, just like red and blue.
Hmm.
However, I, do you see within the microcosm of gun culture that it's changing from a right and left to like a top and down, or
Yes,
okay, I'm glad I'm not alone there.
most certainly. For better or worse, I think that's definitely how it's going. Um, you know, it's. Yeah, I'll give you a small anecdote, right? And I used to get into, occasionally conversations, but it'd have to be through my own accord because, like you said, everything's very hush hush, right? How can you bring up this particular topic in graduate school, even though you're going to law school where opinions are supposed to be shared? But really is, you do feel it as soon as you go into, like, let's say, a more progressive institution, right? You feel you have to, subscribe to a particular set of politics or values, and the thing that, would rub me the wrong way all the time was obviously gun laws, right? Because I went in there knowing full well that, yes, we can agree on a ton of stuff, I can agree with this person on healthcare. I can agree with this person on education, and I can agree with someone on social safety nets because, frankly, it also benefits my argument of firearm ownership. One of my personal opinions, right, when it comes to gun ownership and like violent crime, is because, you know, we really don't have very many social safety nets here for people that are hurting or are dealing with things, and that's as a result of not having conversations and also not delegating proper resources to some of the institutions that can help people who are either in trouble or feel threatened or whatever it is, right? And so, like, these arguments, in my opinion, feed into one another. But being able to go out there and be like, hey, I think owning firearms is a God-given right, and I think that it's the Second Amendment is important. I immediately get labeled as someone who loves everything that Justice Scalia has ever said, right? As an example, right? And so, like, it's tough to have that conversation in some circles because it's really like we talk. And I remember I had a class called Social Justice in the Law that I was really excited about, right? I was like, cool, we get to talk about some of the bigger issues that are affecting society today. We'll talk about some of the bigger social issues that we see in mainstream media and stuff. And I realized it wasn't any of that at all. It was like very, very niche microcosm aspects of things like intersectionality and critical theory and stuff like that. And I'm just sitting there, I'm like, okay, like we have bigger issues. Like there are people protesting on the street for whatever reason, be it like police budget reform, or abortion, for example, or whatever it may be. None of that's being discussed now, right? And like, are we not the law school? Should we not be discussing these aspects in social justice and the law, right? And so,
Yeah, but social justice is a captured term by another brand. Like social justice isn't a justice oriented object. It's a brand mentality. Am I wrong, or or would you disagree with that? Like I
I would disagree with it. I think like we have decades of like proper social justice that brought about things like civil rights and reform and stuff like that. I
all
mean,
right.
as to what it means today, right? Yeah, it could certainly be like weaponized, if you will, by a
Hmm.
particular group to come out, and say like, hey, there's a set of change that we want to make because it's better for society. Social justice is the reason why I want to ban guns. And it's like, okay, I think you're doing a social injustice by banning guns because
Okay.
you can flip the argument upside down and say, hey, you are now disarming me. I'm a minority. Why are you doing that to me? Right? Like I should have the same constitutional protections as the next privileged guy in an uppity neighborhood. Why are you disarming my right to own firearms if I'm growing up broke as hell and I have robberies in my neighborhood every week, right?
Hmm.
And so I think it really is defined by the wielder. If I had to
I think I can work with that one because I think social justice is a term that, well, I mean, we are getting into some good weeds here. But
Hmm,
social justice is a good term to use because in the world that I've seen it wielded, I recognize that there is an accurate term for it, but then there is also a colloquial term.
yeah,
It goes back to the use of the word logic. There's technically what we mean when we're talking about modal logic, prepositional logic, or these kind of things, and then there's, well, logically,
yeah,
and then there's social justice, and then there's social justice warrior, and then there's
yeah,
it goes down this long rabbit hole. But like, okay, then from a gun person, if you
yeah,
were to try to take if you're so take me
yeah.
and take gun culture and say, okay, if you're going to listen to me for 3 seconds, this is what social justice means to you. Well,
Hmm.
how would you communicate that idea?
The enshrining and the uh, rather the guaranteeing of civil liberties in the United States.
The
That's what civil.
guaranteeing of civil liberties in the
Mhm.
United States. All
Yeah,
right.
constitutional rights. Yep.
So if you were to take away the politically charged language of social justice, you would say that it is a civil rights,
Hmm.
it's in the enshrining of civil rights through the use of law.
Correct.
Okay. What is the difference between natural rights and civil rights?
Mm. Well, now you're getting into a bigger discussion, right?
Mm.
It's what do we define? Where do we source our ideas of what we think natural versus civil to be, right?
Yeah.
Because like the conversation is very like me, like I can talk about myself. I'm Muslim, right? So
Yep.
what I consider my natural rights are very indicative and very in line with standard, almost Abrahamic rights, right?
Yeah.
I have the right to live and be free of imprisonment. Let's say I have the right to practice my faith in peace and harmony. I have the right to marry. I have the right to own property. I have the right to do business, right? These are things that I may consider natural, right? The problem is that obviously when you get into what do you source your opinions from, right? And this goes back to more like the separation of church and state conversation. It's how do you clean it up, right? And not necessarily clean it up. I hate using that terminology, but realistically, that's kind of what goes on. How do you get rid of the concept of religion to an extent and make it obviously more legitimate? Because when you bring in religion into a conversation about logic, right, you may be discredited as to have an opinion as hey, I'm religious, therefore I think that X, Y, and Z. And so the conversation kind of gets misguided and gets pushed into a direction of okay, you're just a bot, you're just a hive mind mentality, you're an NPC, if you will. You're just regurgitating whatever biblical narratives you have, and you don't actually believe these things because you cannot separate religion from them. But truly, I mean, religion is a big piece of that. Um,
I think that that era is coming to a I like prediction market. I think that the era of the atheist is sort of dwindling.
you think so? Mm.
Yeah, so I mean, so I come from a very Christian background,
Yeah.
and I mean, I don't, well, I guess if you were to describe it, Reformed Christian. So theology is a considerably important subject to me,
Mhm.
and even in like discussions between different religions, now we have the format and the materials, the language of sorts where we could have these conversations, right?
Yeah.
Which is probably going to have to happen at another time because if we wanted to even have this one or even offline, I'd love to have a long series of conversations with you on these things. But we
Yeah.
both have to make ends meet and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So we'll get into it when when the time is right. But so the issue that we're running into is I'll use Alvin Planning as an example. The American Philosophical Association for a long time sort of held an unwritten rule that there was going to be no Christians, no religious people in the American Philosophical Association. And Alvin Plantinga had a major effect in changing that. And what we're seeing is this, and there's a book that I've recommended reading before, and it's called "How Not to Be Secular," and it alludes onto how we define terms like secular, how we understand the mechanism of belief, and what we think to be religious versus Christian versus these different topics, right? And so it's that when you say it's that act of cleaning it up that you have to do in order to make it palatable.
Hmm.
That's what I mean when I'm talking about multiculturalism, is that you have to be somewhat dishonest about why you believe what you believe in order to make it clean for somebody who's incapable of understanding why you believe, or unwilling to understand why you believe what you believe.
Yeah.
And I do not believe that that is a good foundation for you and I to live in harmony, even though we have Abrahamic but different conclusions,
Yeah.
right? If you want to go back to history, people of the book. However, you and I are able to do that. We are able to live in harmony because we can sit down at the table, break bread, and say, this is what you believe, this is what I believe, this is what I understand to be true here, this is what you understand to be true there. And then we can have that conversation. However, in order for you and I to live in harmony, this is what we have to have acceptable in society. I'm not allowed to steal from you because you're another human being. And you and I agree with that. And then we go on and move
Yeah.
forward.
Basically, the overlap, the middles of the Venn diagrams of our own personal beliefs are what get enshrined and guaranteed by the state as civil liberties, and that's just what
Yeah.
society, considers good, right? And that changes over time, obviously, because society changes over time. For the most part, it's for better or worse. Like we like in our personal capacities, I may consider myself religious. You may consider yourself religious, and so you may look back at that and be like, no, I don't think that should change. I don't think it should change at all because this is how my religion has been for the past 2,000 years or 1,400 years or whatever the heck it is. This is how
Mhm.
I hope it continues to be to the end of time, right? But as society, comes to terms with the fact that we have a diversity of input and opinion, things do change by necessity, uh,
Mhm.
whether we like it or not. And how we come together is, I think, the bigger thing. But yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I think that's an interesting. I don't know if I would take that as an assumption that because things change, because I mean there is the two lines, nothing is new. There's nothing new under the sun, and then there is the reality that like we are in a different age. We have retrospective ways of looking at it. I think, and this is where I think this is, I guess, where we can come. We need to get back to some of the stuff that's going on through your optics manufacturing
Yeah.
because
Sorry, man. I didn't mean to keep taking us on like little.
No, no, but this is what we're here for, right? Like this I believe this is what we're here for, is to have genuine conversation with one another. Not like here on this earth. This is not some like the purpose of life is to talk to each
Yeah,
other, but like genuinely speaking, we can do this. Um, but no, the oh, it'll come back on in a second. My camera just decided to turn off. Um, and I don't know why, but it's funny because it does that at some point in time.
you're good, man.
Oh well, we'll see. Let's see. There you go. Up there you go. I'm back. So this is to kind of bring this part not to a close so much, but when I think of how gun culture comes together and works effectively is that the why I think gun culture is a perfect example of how the world is decentralizing and how especially the West is decentralizing is we recognize that I can voluntarily participate with you and we can have this kind of conversation and we can actually become better people for it.
Yeah,
Whereas if it's imposed upon men in a way that says, hey, you know what, I understand you have a religion, but that doesn't matter. We just have to get along. Like that works in a time of depravity or in desperation, but when it comes to it also creates desperation. Is probably the best way to say it. And so when I think of multiculturalism as an idea, I think of no, I think of human rights. You and I have a rights-based conversation. We believe this to be true. You are a human being. You have a right to bear arms to defend yourselves, and therefore that is and you see that enshrined in your belief system and I see that enshrined in my belief system, so now we come together on that one and let's build a community off of these ideas. That's it's instead of it's just, oh well, let's just get along, like okay,
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's in general. I think people need to be more conversational and more comfortable with having conversation.
yeah.
It's hard because, like, I mean, you keep looking at the upcoming generation of people that we're dealing with. I mean, like, not to keep insulting Zoomers because it's like an easy way to punch down as a millennial, right? But like,
Well, I
you know,
mean, you're literally because they're smaller.
yeah, exactly. They all have noodle arms, right? No, I'm kidding. But I mean, attention spans are getting shorter, man. We live in a world of TikTok and stuff, and so like, it's harder to be able to sit down and have a genuine conversation with someone and just resolve conflict if it arises instead of just I'm gonna dig my heels in. I'm afraid of conflict, and so I'm just gonna continue to sit in the echo chamber and not change anything. And that's I get a very lack of, I guess, familiarity in society, a society that's easily torn apart just by a couple of external factors. And so it's easier to cut up a neighborhood that doesn't have any neighbors in it, if you will,
Oh, for sure.
than it is to cut up a community,
Yeah.
be it someone with more money or political influence or whatever. So
Yeah, but it can be done, and it can be done, like we can it can be done that we do not have to live in the environment of life short immediate
yeah,
turnover. I'm
instant
sorry. We
gratification of information. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, and perhaps the answer is that the people who decide to live in 15-minute echo chambers will eventually find themselves at a great disservice.
yeah,
And it's unfortunate, but I mean, it's sort of like I don't think everyone's going to be I don't think the entire future is going to be 15-second clips.
no,
It's there's genuine conversation, and maybe I'm pulling at strings hoping for my own values to be represented in this culture, but it's what it is. Like if you do not believe in what you believe, if you're not willing to share your values and describe them to people, then do you really believe them? Is
yeah.
probably a real question.
Conviction in what you think is right and wrong. No, you're
Yeah,
like a fake believer in your particular dogma or faith. Yeah.
yeah. If you're not willing to act it out, do you really believe it? If you're not willing to share it, or if someone asks you, it's one thing to be asked a question of like, well, what is the mechanism of salvation by the Christ? And you're like, gosh, atonement's kind of a theologically difficult subject, but this is my thought, and then to stumble your way through it, or like, what is the good is a hard question. And it's one thing to stumble through that question, and it's another one to say, I don't want to answer because I don't want to make anybody mad.
Yeah.
It's like, well, then you don't believe it. I'm sorry, but it doesn't mean anything to you, and in that sense, I think we can overcome that. I think we're making progress. So let's hard segue into some optics here. The so what are the features about um what's the features about the two that you have out right now that are like that really, why do you think your was it your Promethean?
Yeah,
Your-
yeah,
Why is that going to, what is your argument saying that that's going to do so well? Because I'm curious now.
for sure. So the LP1 was set about as not necessarily like reinventing the wheel.
Hmm.
Really, it was just trying to tick as many boxes as possible. The biggest thing that we wanted to accomplish was, creating an optic line that solved particular operator issues so commonplace that they needed to be addressed, right? And I'm not. I'm certainly nowhere, near as decorated as someone as yourself and some of the guys on my team and stuff like that, right? I've never been, I've never fought in combat, right? I've never had to deal with like high stress two-way shooting range, if you will. It's only been one way for me, forward or backwards. So, so for me, it's like I don't, you know, I have not had the livelihood implemented into my daily routine. I only have what everyone brings to us, and I have a little idea wheel to try to throw ideas at the wall, and hence why the little diversity of input that I have on my in my team is so crucial to me because without it, Lead and Steel wouldn't be what it is. We have these different walks of life, and we have this different set of expertise and experience that once it comes together, we can make some really brilliant products. And the solution, particularly for the LP1, was to create an optic that was not only impact and submersion resistant, extremely durable in some of these non-permissive environments, but also to have a large window, large reticle optic that isn't particularly super heavy, more in line with the industry competition, right? And being able to do so while giving people as many of those boxes ticked as possible when selecting a rifle optic. For me, like with my relatively meager experience compared to yours, right? When I'm um, say I'm shooting around cover, right? Um, if I'm running an aim point T1, like you said, personally, I'm not the biggest fan of that tiny 20 millimeter window. Especially when you're dealing with like an awkward cheek rest or cheek hold. Um, you're wearing a plate carrier, for example. Uh, you're not going to have the most perfect sight picture. So having a larger window allows, for me at the very least, a larger margin of error where I can still pick up that red dot, still within that parallax free zone, engage a target at 50, 100 meters, whatever the heck it is, especially when under stress, right? And so, for me it was one of those things where I wanted to make my life a little easier at the range, and I wanted to make the lives of people who may use these things in a more stress-prone environment a little easier, and do so without sacrificing some of the legendary durability and reliability characteristics of the more military accepted weapon sights, right? And so, we take a look at the aim point, for example, that T1, T2 style optic. It's a very hardy unit, right? Very rarely do those things fail. When they do, it's usually as a result of adhesive failure or emitter failure or some other electrical issue, right? But realistically, they're designed so well to take on more of a distributed load of impact and redirect that kinetic energy to the weapon system, that they end up lasting a while. And so, for us, it's not as simple as just simply blowing up the sight picture and expecting the housing to be able to withstand the same amount of abuse or exceed that level of abuse as some of the industry competition. And so, for us, it was we're not just bringing a product to market and simply saying this is it and we're going to sell it and it's awesome because it is, and not be able to flesh out in detail the science, the engineering, and the philosophical whys and hows behind that product, so that we have the most well drawn out and fleshed out sales pitch, if you will. Because realistically, I'm not the best salesman, right? The guys on my team, and my sales director is a fucking awesome salesman. But the important thing is that the product needs to sell itself, right? I can't simply rely on people, because I'm not going to be able to sleep at night. Yes, I may make a ton of money on snake oil sales, if you will, but that doesn't fall in line with my personal ethos, right? As we discussed. And so I need to be able to trust this myself, right? Like on my own, like home defense carbine, I have an LP1, right?
Hmm.
And it's because I trust the optical design. It's because I trust the weapon system, and it's because I trust our engineering and our manufacturing and our quality control and quality assurance. And like I'm not BSing here. This is serial number one on the rifle and serial number one on the optic. It's been here since, being ran through the gamut since, and that's because we 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 believe what we're selling to people. And so the LP1 is a small representation of that. It was our best foot forward. Like I said, we weren't necessarily reinventing the wheel, but we wanted to offer as much capability to the end user as realistically possible, given the constraints of current manufacturing, material selection, sourcing,
Hmm.
uh, and assembly. And so that's the LP1, man. It has to operate well under night vision. If you're a passive shooter, me personally, I don't really like to shoot passively. There you go. That's a set of dual tubes there. But like I personally, I don't like to shoot passively unless I'm like coyote hunting. There you go. Um, uh, but my own philosophy is that I usually keep my reticle on just bright enough so if I need to flip up my nods real quick, I can see something, right? But some guys wanted something that obviously was even more crisp at night, particularly so they can hang out and do fun stuff, right at 2 a.m. And so we obviously we calibrate for that with some of the current output on our various reticle options. So you can get that crisp sight picture if you want. We also go like freaking nuclear bright if we want to. You know, I remember from the first batch, we had current dialed in and it was perfect. I remember maxing out the brightness at a level where I thought if the operator accidentally went to the max output, their optic wasn't going to die in like a month. But it was still bright enough, at least in Ohio, on our super bright sunny day in the middle of winter where like there's snow everywhere. I'd still be able to very quickly pick up that red dot. And still, I had a couple guys be like, "Man, I wish it was brighter." Not because I need it to be brighter, but because it would be cool if it was brighter. And I was like, "Okay, screw you guys. We'll give it another brightness setting and make it nuclear bright. Are you happy now?" Right? Um,
Do you have to like set thresholds so people don't start blinding themselves?
yeah, we do. I mean, granted,
Yeah,
it's LED, it's not a laser, so like the probability of risk
you're
is
gonna be fine. Yeah.
yeah.
I
But
still think I just think it's funny too because you made you right off the bat though like that those are some pretty big examples, right? So I've lived in a desert. I live in a desert environment. I do a lot of stuff at night. I'm playing with night vision all the time. We're working on a project now with night vision Surons subguns. It's kind of a lot of fun.
nice. Okay.
But needless to say, we're working on some it's neat. But the the snow is the big one. You're like, oh, it's really bright out. Like, try doing really bright plus snow.
Yeah.
You're not gonna see much
Yeah.
because most people think really bright plus sand.
Yeah.
The difference between sand and snow is completely game changing. Where
The
you
amount
have to,
of reflection off the
it,
terrain is
so
ridiculous.
that's a really good identifier though. So neat there. Do you have the same when you're looking at the Pandora? That's your closed emitter. Are you looking at the same stuff there? Are we looking at like same brightness and dot clarity?
The glass is sourced from the same Japanese OEM, and it's one of the reasons why. Look, Jesus, it's okay.
Yeet.
Take a beating. It's one of the reasons why the glass is super clear as you look through it. I mean, granted, you need to have a little bit of anti-reflective coatings on the objective, and you need to be able to have reflection off the objective for you to superimpose the red dot. But
Mhm.
if you can kind of make that perfectly balanced approach, you get something that's clearer than holographic weapon sights, but also still giving you excellent battery life and not showing too much through the objective. And so that was the same philosophy with the Pandora, right? Closed emitter pistol dots, a lot of them are pretty mediocre in terms of light transmission, and that's it's one thing to say, oh, my glass is so clear I can see everything through it. Okay, a little bit of blue notch is not terrible, but when you're shooting under night vision, yes, when you're already working with a limited amount of light that can enter the optical system, yes, it's important to have excellent glass clarity, particularly if you're trying to reduce the effect of parallax. If you have an issue with your convex lens, um, it's it's a problem. You can exacerbate the issue at closer distances if you don't have the most perfect sight picture within the optical axis. And so, translating much of the philosophy of the LP1, we're also putting it into the Pandora, right? The LP1, on one hand, is an extremely durable tank of a unit. It is made for kinetic energy redirection as reasonably as you can do so, with a little bit of impact absorption through this user replaceable sacrificial hood. This is an extruded piece of 6,000 series aluminum. The compression yield ratio is less than that of the 7,000 series, excuse me, that comprises the housing. And so this is made to compress under impact, similar to like the hood of your car the crumple zone of your car, if you will,
Mhm.
under impact, because it's obviously exponential in terms of the amount of kinetic energy that comes to you as the end user. For amount of crumple that you get, it's that much less by factor, that you feel in the actual optical housing, or you as the driver. And so that was important for us. It wasn't just just beat the heck out of the optic and hope it survives. No, it's let's redirect some of the kinetic energy and give some people some wiggle room. Let's buy them a few more newtons, right, or joules. And so the Pandora is a little trickier, obviously, because now we are playing with the addition of mass on reciprocating slides, which requires particular timing paired to the ammunition selection and the spring rate and stuff. And so by necessity, we had to be in line with the industry competitors, uh, which gave us pretty decent idea. Pandora, one of the reasons why the window size is significantly larger than, say, like an Aimpoint Acro P2, and I think one of the other Chinese OEMs that we saw come up recently that seems to offer some pretty cool products. Um, Swamp Fox, they have their own closed emitter pistol dot. Um, is we're not using what's considered an erector tube design, right? The tube that sits inside of your optic, particularly the Acro P2, um, is effectively, think of it as like a little toilet paper roll that houses the LED or the emitter inside the base of it. So that little toilet paper roll has a little emitter inside, and that entire roll sits inside of the optic housing. And when you are, adjusting the windage and elevation on that optical system,
Mhm.
you're moving just the internal tube. You're not actually moving the emitter inside the housing. And so you have this larger housing, and then you have this smaller tube that has the adjustments on it. And so when you look through the optic, you have a very small sight picture, even though you have a relatively large footprint. Right?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Ah, that makes sense. So you've got a tube inside of a tube, and what you're doing is that outside tube doesn't move because that gets mounted to your optic or your
Correct.
rifle, your pistol. But what you're doing is you're taking that inside tube and you're rotating it around.
Precisely.
Okay, so that makes sense. The erect, yeah, because I mean, I've looked inside a scope before. I've seen a couple things, and that just makes a lot of sense. But so
Yeah.
you did not go with an erector tube
We did not.
construction.
All we did
Okay.
is we took the LP1 and flipped it upside down.
Oh.
Because we can't really place a base bottom side emitter and expect to have windage and elevation dials hanging off the ass end of the optic and acting directly on the diode. It's not going to work with your rear sight. It's not going to work with the overall footprint, and you're going to shorten the amount of glass length between the objective and the ocular.
Hmm.
It's kind of what some of the hollow suns do that, and unfortunately, the bigger issue that you run into is parallax, right? So we just flipped this upside down, and credit where credit is due. Steiner was the first to do this with their MPS, right? They have a topside emitter. And so what happens is now you have the windage and elevation controls at the top corner of the optic acting directly on the diode, right? Which means you mount your optic, right? And now you have a small windage dial towards the top, has a long tube that cuts across the top of the optic back here to connect to the emitter. And then the elevation dial was just directly on top of the emitter. So you act on the emitter and you get rid of the erector tube entirely. And so now you have that much larger of an internal window for the same exterior space. So you save a little weight by losing the erector tube, and now I can add mass to my optical system to help me with impact resistance. Right, that buys me that many more, tenths of an ounce. And so now we can be a little more, uh, I don't know, confident in where we add material to help redirect some of that kinetic energy. Now, the Pandora,
Generous.
there you go, yeah, generous. Um, so the Pandora is not indestructible, obviously. It's certainly not going to hold to the same abuses as the LP1. And as a small electrical component to your aiming device, it will certainly be more sensitive to impact abuse. But will it fail earlier than the competition? No, it'll withstand significantly more. That's based in theory through finite element analysis and also through our own like real world destructive testing through the various stages of optic design.
Hmm.
And so we should have some pre-production media units going out here, hopefully in a couple weeks, for some guys to take a look at, get some, units in the wild for people to see that, this is a real thing. It's not just our ugly prototypes or renders on the website. Um, but, we're excited to see where it goes, particularly in line with Trigicon, allegedly also coming out with their own closed emitter pistol dot. And it seems like we'll be able to handle that competition just fine with some of the feature set that we're bringing to market right now. But really, the Pandora is the best of both worlds, comparing the Acro P2 and the Steiner MPS. One of the reasons why the Steiner MPS is faulted by some of the operators, although it has a more generous window size, battery life is the big thing that takes a hit. Utilizes a 1632 cell, right? And so your runtime is significantly shorter than the Acro P2, which uses a CR2032, that coin battery that everyone knows for your T1. And so we get the window size of the MPS, we get the battery life of the Acro P2 by utilizing the same CR2032. And so now we have a happy medium, and we're cheaper than both. And so, it seems like a knockout product, and I'm hoping that is the case. My only hesitation, being extremely forthright with your audience as the CEO of this company, um, I know what it's like to have quality assurance and quality control on a mass scale, and particularly as you scale, that's the first thing to go. And having some inside sources of some of our competition, even places like Aimpoint. It seems like some of our larger contract competitors might be dealing with some of their own quality control issues, and these are guys who are significantly larger than our operation. And so for me, it poses a risk because in theory everything is great. As we get into mass manufacturing, I expect to see some problems that we'll have to address with rolling changes. So hopefully nothing crazy. Obviously, the LP1 was an excellent success. We didn't have any like major recalls or anything like that. And I'm hoping the same with our Pandora. We've spent a lot of time and money every time we tool up for just one pre-production unit to beat the hell out of. It costs us significantly more, multitudes, factors more than just the end, unit economics cost of one particular unit because you're spinning up machines to just make one product. Um, and so, I hope, it doesn't go to waste. I hope that we have an excellent launch for the Pandora. And so far, so great in the development cycle. But that's just bringing two optics SKUs to market, man. We addressed. I'll pause my monologue. Actually, I should say because I've talked a lot. But go ahead.
No, it's good to hear you working out and talking about like what you, because it's time spent, man. Like this is when I kind of, when we started talking about the conversation, when we started our conversation, you know, a while ago now, one of the things that we're talking about was just kind of like grand narratives in the industry and in
Yeah.
culture. And it's like an example of a grand narrative, which is not actually the correct use of the term grand narrative, but like sort of, this is where you get the zeitgeist.
Mhm.
But it's you get this idea like, oh well, the industry's captured, there is no innovation, nothing new is under the sun. Or you get everyone who works in a company is just a corporate drone. Or it's like, and none, and we don't really believe these things, but we say things like that very often until we encounter something that kind of pulls us out of it, which we call adventure, and then we pursue it and we want it. And it's interesting to hear you talk about building a product, because I find many of the things that we went from talking religious philosophy, which is a no-no in some part of the world, to like, okay, so this is what we did with an optic. And I think that those two things are not very far apart. I do almost ascribe to the Aristotelian complete man idea of like, know your trade, know your craft, know what you believe.
Yep. Yeah, I like
So
that. That's good, man. But yeah, it's it's interesting, but it's also been a wild ride to get here because, like, optics design and manufacturing is very different than what most people may, initially assume by looking at a polished website from a competitor manufacturer and a large Instagram following or something, and their favorite influencer talking about an optic. So much so that people will rely on some of these companies for their life-saving equipment. And for me, it's just, have you really questioned your weapon light manufacturer? Have you really questioned your firearms manufacturer? Have you really questioned your optics manufacturer and the
yeah,
technical level of detail and expertise? Because I'll give you a little tidbit, a little trade secret of the industry here that I'll sprinkle in. A lot of what you see on the market from optics manufacturing is all subcontracted Chinese or Southeast Asian manufacturing. So much so that you can go to, and after the call, I'll go ahead and send you. We regularly get these, manufacturing solicitations because we've kind of met that like critical mass where we're, beginning to, get some offers from random nation, optics factories and stuff. And you'll see an optical design and be like, oh, that kind of looks like something that I know. And then you go to like a smaller optic competitor brand and you see their product and you see that they're charging $400 for an optic that this contractor just solicited to you at $55 a unit. And you're like, oh, they didn't even change shit. They just laser engrave their logo and send it out to distribution and everyone just buys it. I was looking at a particular example of something, and I had a buddy of mine who came in and was carrying his Glock 19, and he had a particular competitor's closed emitter dot on there. And I'm like, you know what this is, right? Like, this is, let me show you where they found this from. And he paid $400 for said optic on sale, right? And I told him, I was like, this is the factory that just made it for them, and they offered it to us for like, pennies on the dollar.
Hmm.
All this company did was just blanket resale, and they said that this was their own design, and they spent time perfecting, and really they're just Amazon knockoffs, and that's how the bulk of the industry works. There are not very many OEMs, right? And and I get that, right? It's not a bad thing. Like, I look at my operating expenses, and I know they're significantly higher than what they should be because of some of the operations that we take in house. And in 4 or 5 months' time, we will have a fully American-made rifle dot that we're codenaming the Reclaimer. It's going to borrow much of the LP1's features, but it's American sourced and assembled. Right now we have a smorgasbord of sourcing with our own assembly, but when we do that, we'll be able to separate the lines. Then the LP1 will probably get, you know, pushed off to one of those factories to do the assembly for us as we maintain the OpEx of the American product, because now we'll be able to capture that part of the market where people are going to say, hey, I'm not gonna buy anything unless it's fully American made, no exceptions. And we're like, cool, here it is, but it's going to be $500, right? And if you're not willing to buy that, that's fine. I don't want to price you guys out. Here's the LP1 now made in some country with the same Japanese sourcing of materials, but assembly with being a little cheaper, so I can save some OpEx. So I get why some of these companies do what they do, because they have higher operational expenditures, and they have an operation that they need to run with several employees and a lot of fat on the edges and stuff like that. But for me, it's like you're selling out for the most part by doing that, and you're not really committing to the message that you're telling people, which is, hey, these are our designs and this is our manufacturing. It's not really your designs. You're just paying someone else to do it for you, and making a bunch of money on top and telling people it's duty grade. But like, okay, that's fine. Is your personal carry gun carrying your products? Do you trust it that much for your own life? For a lot of these companies, I think no. I don't think they would. I think they would trust a bigger contractor, and that's just the nature of the game. So, you know, that's my small rant on optics manufacturing in the industry, as to where it goes right now. But yeah, a lot of people are being had, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, you can disrupt it one day at a time. There's never going to be a glorious revolution of the optics industry. It always
No.
has to take time. But I mean, look at it the way that we've done here is that once again we're back at the table where it's not Aimpoint versus EOTech anymore. Still great optics. They still perform well. I mean, I've trusted my life on both of them many times. And that's not an argument of quality. That's just my experience. That's an anecdote. And so I think that the this is going to go back to philosophy. I think that opportunities to look at how we think about and evaluate good quality equipment is now in the hands of the end user and and in the individual or the end user. And the end user has grown vastly from Ranger Battalion guys to Tennessee homesteaders, and
Yeah.
we're okay with that. Like
Mhm.
that's what we're going for. So
I
I
see it.
do
Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
I,
Forgive me.
I do appreciate it. Like, we can get into the infighting on who does what and does this how, and I think that there's going to be some place for that. But
Mhm.
for us as individuals and for us as individuals in gun culture, how we think about and how we make our evaluations is always what represents in our life. And I think that's kind of like the small things. For some reason, gun culture teams seems to evaluate the value of a person based on the value of their gear, and then they do it inversely by the more expensive stuff you are, the worse of a person you are. No one knows how to make sense of it, and it's
Yeah.
funny, but we move on. So, I've taken a bunch of your time. You've got the Pandora coming out. People can pre-order that now.
Yeah, they can pre-order it now at the Secure Unit at launch. We're expecting to launch hopefully in August, potentially
Okay.
sooner if I nail all my contractor ETAs. And then we are actively working on an LCAN competitor, which is
Yep.
good, bringing that into the 21st century, and giving people some better options. We have an ACOG competitor that's pretty much done in terms of optical design. It's just a bunch of prototyping that I have to do probably after the LCAN,
Mhm.
and a bunch of other designs that are currently being worked on, and even a little bit of weapon lights. So, with some interesting, technology that we're trying to license and implement now. And then, we haven't even talked about the rifle line. Not to sound like a greedy salesman, but we do have excellent carbines. This is our all-rounder carbine, or our ARC.
Nice.
This utilizes the most bomb-proof gas system in the industry, with a chrome line barrel, and we individually gauge, test fire, proof test, and magnetic particle inspect Our bolts, every rifle is test fired. It's lightweight, suppressor ready, and the rifle that you can certainly rely on if you ever needed it to. And that's the general philosophy is as we enter every aspect of this industry to try to dominate it, whether it's optics or small arms or nylon, with these three things being the largest you know things here. We're prioritizing the quality assurance, the reliability and dependability, and trying our best to offer it at a fair price, not an inflated price. So we're kind of like Toyota in that sense, with a little bit of continuous improvement.
It's a great reference though. Toyota's fantastic with their. I still want a Hilux, but it will always be on that page. That's just what it means to be a 21st century man.
Yep.
I mean, why do you want what you want? I don't know, but I had it once. So you don't know what you had until it's gone, like the Toyota Hilux in Afghanistan, 2010.
Mm-hmm.
So, Ahmad, this has been a really great conversation over the last, these. I know it's going to be split into 2 episodes, but I've really enjoyed this conversation for a couple of
Thanks.
reasons. One of them is that you're willing to come on and talk about things that we really do care about, right? It's the things that we think to be right and true and good. How do we deal with difficult conversations, whether it's about multiculturalism, religious differences, manufacturing frustrations? I thank you for taking the time to come in, have a talk, and even talk about things that are not like just normal talking point stuff. It's been very, very useful. I think I've gained from it. I hope our audience has gained from it. We know your stuff is coming out. Plug it one more time. Let's call it a day because at some point in time, I want to have another conversation with you, but I'm looking at the clock and we're pushing too far.
Yeah, I appreciate it, man. So one last time, leadandsteel.com. Our Instagram is leadsteel, and our subreddit rather is just lead and steel. And you can also find us on YouTube, where we regularly go in depth, almost Rain Man esque, as my sales director calls it, where we go into technical rifle deep dives, competitor rifle deep dives, comparisons, gun reviews, random stuff, as well as obviously product releases and product updates like Orwake to our LP1, and some of the other patents and stuff that we're working on and designs. And so we'll give you that, guys. And obviously, if you don't mind, please sign up for our newsletter. It's important for us to be able to have a reliable, method of communication to the industry and to be able to show people what it is that we're working on, because I think you'll genuinely get a benefit from it. Competition is good in this space. So that's that.
Alrighty, cool. Well, this has been the Redacted Culture Cast. We are wrapping up with the episode with Ahmad here from Lead and Steel. You just introduced yourself, so now I made myself sound like some sort of generic radio host. But if you want to find us on the internet, you can find us at redactedculture.llc, or no, sorry, redactedculture.locals.com. That's going to be the black site where we host like more close to home conversations, and we have discussions about episodes and things that have gone on. And that is where you can support the show as well. And then our website is redactedllc.com. So redactedculture.locals.com, black site. Redacted LLC, that's where our t-shirts and stuff are. And then you can also find us on Instagram at redactedllc, unless they get censorious again. But it's been a great time. Thanks for the conversation, and we will talk to you soon. Keep your hatchet sharp and your powder dry.